It was just another freezing night in New York until the Billionaire stopped when no one else did. A little girl stood alone in the snow, clutching a wrinkled note that read, "I can clean. I can help. Please." When she looked up and whispered, "Sir, could you hold me for a moment?" He didn't know that one hug would uncover a secret so deep it would test everything he believed in and change the meaning of his life forever. Snow drifted down over Fifth Avenue like a whisper, soft and relentless. The city was wrapped in gold light and laughter, but for Ethan Crawford the night felt colder than ever. He had just stepped out of a charity gala where everyone had called him a genius, a visionary, the kind of man who could solve the world's problems with one signature. Yet, as he stood there buttoning his cashmere coat, he felt the one problem he could never fix: the emptiness that had lived in his chest since the day he buried his daughter. He glanced at his reflection in the black window of the limousine, a man who had everything and yet nothing that mattered. Inside the car, warmth waited. A driver, a schedule, another evening of polite smiles. He almost climbed in. Almost. Until something caught his attention, a faint sound, soft and trembling, cutting through the hum of Christmas carols and traffic. A small figure stood by the curb, half hidden in the snow, a little girl no older than 8 wearing a coat too thin for December. Her hands clutched a piece of paper, her breath a ghost in the freezing air. People walked past her, some glanced, most didn't. Ethan hesitated, then he stepped closer. "Are you lost?" he asked. She looked up at him with eyes far too old for her face. "No, sir, I'm waiting." "For who?" "For someone kind," she whispered. He froze. The city noise blurred around them. Something about the way she said it, so plain, so honest, hit him harder than any business failure or loss. He knelt down, his voice gentle. "What's your name, Lila?" she said. "Lila Bennett." The name felt fragile, like glass in the snow. Ethan noticed her shoes soaked through full of holes. He wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but she spoke first. "My mom's at the hospital," she murmured. "She's really sick. Grandma says she needs medicine, but it costs too much. I just wanted to wait here, in case someone could help." He didn't know what to say. She wasn't begging. She wasn't crying. Just standing there as if hope itself kept her warm. And then, after a moment of silence, she looked up at him again and said the words that would change his life forever. "Sir, could you hold me for a moment?" It wasn't a plea, it was a request for something deeper, something raw and human. For a man who had spent years hiding behind logic and success, those words cracked open something buried deep inside. He hesitated only for a second before he opened his arms. Lila stepped forward, her small frame pressed against his chest, shivering. Ethan felt her heartbeat faint and uneven against his own. Her coat smelled faintly of smoke and cold air. He wrapped his arms around her, unsure why tears suddenly burned behind his eyes. He hadn't cried in 7 years, not since the day he lowered his daughter's casket into the ground. But here, in the middle of Manhattan's glittering winter, something in him broke open. The sound that came out wasn't grief, it was release. When she finally pulled away, she handed him the crumpled paper she'd been holding. He unfolded it carefully. In uneven, childish handwriting, it read, "I can clean. I can help. I don't cry in front of people." And at the bottom, one small word, "Please." Ethan stared at it, unable to speak. It wasn't a letter, it was survival on a page. "Where's your grandmother?" he asked quietly. "At the shelter on 82nd, Lila said. But I didn't want to go back yet. It's cold there, and she's tired all the time." He nodded slowly, the decision forming before he even realized it. "Come on," he said, standing. "I'll take you home." Her eyes widened. "You don't have to." "I know," he said softly, "but I want to." They drove through the city in silence, snow swirling outside like confetti. Lila pressed her face to the window, whispering the names of the buildings as they passed, as if memorizing the city before it forgot her. Ethan watched her reflection in the glass, small, quiet, but full of a strength he couldn't name. When they reached the shelter, she turned to him and smiled a small, tired smile that carried more gratitude than words ever could. "You remind me of my mom," she said. "She used to say people forget how to see each other. You didn't forget." Ethan didn't respond. He couldn't. The words stuck somewhere between his throat and his heart. Later that night, back in his penthouse overlooking Central Park, he stood by the window long after midnight. The city stretched below him, bright, endless, indifferent. Yet, for the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible to it. He felt connected to the child in the snow, to his own humanity, to something bigger than himself. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer he hadn't spoken since he was a father. Not for success, not for redemption, just for purpose. He didn't know it yet, but that purpose had already found him wrapped in a child's hug and written in shaky pencil on a wrinkled piece of paper. And soon the world would learn what one man with everything would risk for a little girl who asked for nothing more than to be held. The next morning, New York was still buried under a quiet blanket of snow. The city hadn't quite woken up yet, just the distant hum of cabs and the sigh of wind between towers. Ethan Crawford sat alone in the corner of a small cafe on Lexington Avenue, his untouched espresso growing cold. Across from him, Lila Bennett held a mug of hot chocolate with both hands, as if it were the only thing keeping her alive. The waitress, noticing her soaked sneakers and threadbare coat, looked as though she wanted to ask questions but didn't. There was something in the way Ethan sat his composure, his tailored coat that made people hesitate. He wasn't a man used to being questioned, but this morning he was the one asking. "Lila," he said gently, "where do you live?" The girl's eyes stayed on her cocoa. "With my grandma, but sometimes we have to move. The man from the building said we couldn't stay when we stopped paying rent." Ethan leaned forward, his voice softer now. "And your mother? She's in the hospital." Lila nodded. "St. Mary's. She's been there a long time. She says it's just her kidneys, but I think it's worse." She hesitated, biting her lip before adding, "They said she needs a special medicine. But Grandma said it costs too much." Ethan's chest tightened. There it was again, the unbearable simplicity of a child's truth. He'd sat in hundreds of meetings about billions of dollars, but none of them had ever made him feel this powerless. "Do you visit her often?" he asked. Lila nodded. "Every day after school. But yesterday they said kids can't go inside anymore. I waited in the lobby until the nurse told me to leave. So, I walked here." She said it as if walking miles through freezing streets was nothing. He looked down at the wrinkled paper she'd given him the night before. It was damp now, the pencil marks fading. Still, one line caught his eye. "I can help." He folded it carefully and slid it into his wallet. "Lila," he said quietly, "how long have you been helping?" She thought for a moment. "Since I was 5. Grandma can't walk fast anymore, so I buy groceries. I make cereal for dinner. I'm not good at eggs yet." Her voice cracked on that last sentence, though she tried to smile. Ethan felt something shift inside him, a mix of guilt and awe. He had spent years surrounded by people who had everything and still complained. And here sat a child who had nothing yet carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone twice her age. He signaled the waitress and ordered pancakes, extra butter, and a second cocoa. When the plate arrived, Lila's eyes widened as if she hadn't seen that much food in months. But before she took a bite, she looked at him and whispered, "Is it okay?" He nodded. "It's more than okay." She ate slowly, carefully, as though she didn't want to waste the moment. Ethan watched her, his mind racing. Every instinct told him to call his assistant to arrange something official, a donation, a foundation, a plan. But that felt wrong. This wasn't about charity. It was about connection. When she finished, he asked, "Would you like to go see your mom today?" Her eyes flickered with a mix of fear and hope. "Can we?" The nurse said. "Let me worry about the nurse," he interrupted, smiling for the first time in days. By the time they reached St. Mary's Hospital, the morning sun had started to melt the snow into silver puddles. Ethan's driver opened the door, but he waved him off. He wanted to walk beside her. People stared as they entered the tall, sharply dressed man and the small girl holding his hand. At the front desk, a nurse looked up in confusion. "Can I help you, sir?" Ethan nodded. "We're here for Elena Bennett, room 207. The nurse frowned. Visiting hours start at noon, and Ethan pulled out his business card. "I won't take long." Something in his tone made her hesitate. She typed something into her computer, then nodded toward the elevators. End of the hall, left side. Inside the elevator, Lila's grip tightened around his fingers. Her voice was barely a whisper. "She sleeps most of the time now. But she'll hear me. She always does." When they reached the room, Lila stopped at the door, gathering courage. Ethan followed her in silence. The sight that met him stopped him cold. A woman lay in the narrow bed, her face pale, her breathing shallow. Tubes and monitors surrounded her like a fragile fortress. And yet, even in that fragility, there was beauty, soft features that mirrored Lila's hands, that looked once strong, now thin and still. Lila climbed onto the chair beside the bed and touched her mother's hand. "Mom, it's me," she whispered. "I brought someone." Ethan stood by the doorway, feeling like an intruder in a sacred space. For a man used to controlling rooms, he suddenly didn't know how to move, how to speak. "She was a nurse," Lila said, looking back at him. "She helped people all the time. Then she got sick. The hospital said the medicine costs more than what she made in a year." Her words landed like stones in his chest. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "She sounds brave." "She is," Lila said. "Even when she can't talk, she holds my hand like this." She pressed her mother's fingers tighter. "That's how I know she's still fighting." Ethan swallowed hard. He'd seen strength before in boardrooms and battles of ego and money. But this was different. This was survival stripped bare without applause or headlines. He turned to the window. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent. For the first time, he wondered how many stories like this were playing out right now, how many unseen lives brushed against his own without him noticing. When he looked back, Lila was watching him carefully, as if measuring whether he truly understood. She said, "People with money can fix things," the girl whispered. "Is that true?" He wanted to say yes, but the truth stuck in his throat. "I don't know," he said finally, "but I'd like to try." For the first time since he'd met her, Lila smiled, not the cautious kind, but something small and real. As they left the hospital, Ethan felt the air change. The city no longer looked the same. Every corner, every passerby seemed to hold a story he had ignored for years. That evening, he sat alone in his office, staring at the wrinkled paper she had written on. The words, "I can help," seemed to echo in his mind like a promise. He pressed the intercom. "Call Dr. Winslow at St. Mary's," he told his assistant. "I want Elena Bennett's medical records, and make it confidential." There was silence on the other end. "Mr. Crawford, may I ask why?" He paused, his eyes on the skyline where night was falling fast, because he said quietly, "It's time I start helping too." And for the first time in years, that decision didn't feel like business. It felt like healing. Ethan Crawford had made hundreds of decisions in his life, some worth millions, others that shifted the world of business overnight. But none of them felt like this one. None of them made his hands tremble or his heart race the way it did now. It had been 3 days since he last saw Lila. 3 days since he'd stood in that hospital room watching Elna Bennett fight for her life, her frail body framed by the hum of machines. He hadn't stopped thinking about it since. Her illness wasn't just severe, it was terminal without a kidney transplant, and there was no donor match on record. He'd read the report twice then, a third time, as if the words might change if he stared long enough. But they didn't. No compatible donor available. That sentence wouldn't leave him alone. His assistant Claire entered quietly, holding a folder. "The hospital confirmed it, sir. The wait list is over a year long. They don't think she'll make it through winter." Ethan looked out over Manhattan's skyline. The sun was setting behind the glass towers, washing everything in gold. It should have been beautiful, but tonight it felt cruel. A city overflowing with everything, and yet a woman who had spent her life helping others was about to die because she couldn't afford time. He turned back to Claire. "Find out what it takes to be tested." She blinked. "Tested for what? For compatibility," he said. "For the transplant." She hesitated, unsure if she'd heard correctly. "You mean yourself?" Ethan nodded slowly. "Yes. Me." There was a long silence before she whispered, "That's unorthodox." "Unthinkable," he corrected softly, "which means it's probably the right thing to do." 2 days later, he sat in a private clinic on the Upper East Side, his sleeve rolled up, as a nurse drew his blood. He'd done hundreds of interviews in his life, but this was the first time he'd ever felt like the outcome actually mattered. The doctor, a calm man in his 50s, adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Crawford, do you understand what you're asking? Donating a kidney isn't like signing a check. It's invasive. It carries risk." "I understand," Ethan said quietly. "Run the tests." The waiting was the hardest part. For 48 hours he barely slept. Every sound in his penthouse echoed too loud, the clock ticking the hum of the refrigerator his own heartbeat. He'd built a life on numbers, but now he found himself praying for something that couldn't be measured. When the phone finally rang, he answered before the first ring ended. "Mr. Crawford," the doctor said, his tone unreadable. "The results are in." Ethan's grip tightened. "And you're a compatible donor." For a moment he didn't breathe. It was as if the world stopped, just the city's hum beneath him, and the weight of those words. Compatible. It felt like more than a coincidence. He hung up and sat in silence. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, slow and deliberate, blanketing the city in white. He thought of Lila, her small voice, her paper note, her hope, and then he thought of Elena fading quietly in that hospital bed. The decision wasn't a decision anymore. It was a calling. At dawn, he returned to St. Mary's. The staff was startled to see him. He didn't look like a man arriving for business. No driver, no entourage, no suit. Just a wool coat, a scarf, and a resolve that could break stone. He found Dr. Winslow in the corridor. "I'm a match," he said. "Schedule the surgery." The doctor blinked. "Mr. Crawford, you don't have to, I know," he interrupted. "But I want to." Word spread quickly through the hospital. By the afternoon, the city's most private billionaire had become its most talked-about mystery. But Ethan refused interviews, donations, or headlines. No press, he told the staff. This isn't a story, it's a life. Later that evening, he stood by Elena's bedside. She was weaker now, her breathing shallow. Lila sat curled on the chair beside her, clutching a stuffed bear. When Ethan walked in, she looked up. "Did you bring medicine for Mom?" she asked softly. He knelt beside her. "Something like that," he said. "But it's going to take a little time." Lila's eyes searched his face, confused. "Will it hurt?" He smiled faintly. "Maybe a little. but sometimes love hurts before it heals. She nodded slowly, not understanding, but sensing something important. That night before surgery, Ethan stood alone in the sterile hospital corridor. Through the glass he could see the snow still falling, the streetlights blurring into soft halos. He thought of his daughter Grace, the way she used to hug him after bad dreams. She had died at 11 in a car accident that shattered everything he believed in. He hadn't prayed since then, until now. Take care of her, he whispered to no one and everyone, both of them. When he woke from the operation, the pain hit, first sharp, real, undeniable. But then came the sound of a heartbeat monitor, steady and alive. For a moment he didn't know if it was his or hers. Then he heard voices outside the curtain. "She's stable," a nurse said. "The new kidney's responding." Ethan closed his eyes. Relief flooded through him like light. Hours later, when they finally let Lila visit, she tiptoed to his bedside, her hands clutching the same wrinkled paper she'd written days before. "Mom's awake," she said softly. "The doctor said she's getting better." "Did you do that?" Ethan's throat tightened. He nodded, barely managing to speak. "We both did." She climbed onto the chair beside him and whispered, "You're like the angel my grandma talks about." He smiled, exhausted. "No Lila. Just a man who forgot how to care. You reminded me." As she held his hand, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not pride, not power, but peace. It wasn't the peace that comes from success or applause. It was the kind that comes when you finally do something that matters. Outside the window, snow continued to fall over New York, quiet and unrelenting. Somewhere across the city, people hurried home unaware that in one small hospital room, 2 lives had been bound together forever. Not by blood, not by wealth, but by a moment of impossible grace. And though Ethan would never admit it aloud as he drifted into sleep, one thought lingered in his heart. Maybe the girl who once asked for a hug had saved him long before he ever saved her. The world felt muted when Ethan Crawford opened his eyes again. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of machines. For a moment he didn't know where he was. His body felt heavy, his mind fogged. Then it hit him, the surgery, the hospital, Elena Bennett. He turned his head, slowly wincing, and saw the morning light filtering through the blinds. He wasn't sure how long he'd been unconscious. The clock on the wall meant nothing. It could have been hours or days. But when the door opened and a familiar small voice whispered, "You're awake," the world came rushing back. Lila stood there holding a paper cup of orange juice, her hair messy, her eyes wide with relief. "Mom's better," she said quickly, as if afraid the words would vanish if she didn't say them fast enough. "The doctors said her new kidney's working. She's awake." Ethan tried to speak, but his throat was dry. She ran to him, pressing the cup into his hand. "Here. The nurse said you might be thirsty." He managed a hoarse laugh. "You're taking care of me now." She nodded, her small face serious. "You helped her, so I have to help you." For the first time in weeks, Ethan smiled. Not the polite, practiced one he wore at fundraisers, but something real soft. The days that followed blurred together. Mornings with nurses checking vitals, quiet afternoons watching snow melt on the window ledge, and evenings when Lila would sneak in with her homework, sitting cross-legged at the foot of his bed. She talked about her school, about the stories her grandma used to tell about how her mom would make pancakes shaped like hearts when she was little. Ethan listened. He didn't talk much, but something about her chatter made the sterile room feel alive again. A week later, they allowed him to walk down the hall. His body still ached, but he wanted to see Elena. The nurse wheeled him into her room, and for a long moment he just stood there watching. Elena Bennett looked fragile, but her color had returned. Her eyes, though tired, were awake, clear, and full of quiet strength. When she saw him, she reached out a trembling hand. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. Ethan shook his head. You don't have to. Just get better." Tears filled her eyes. "Lila told me what you did. You gave me something I can never repay." He met her gaze steadily. "Then don't. Just live. That's all I ask." She smiled weakly. "You sound like my late husband. He used to say the same thing to his patients. He was a nurse too." That detail hit Ethan harder than expected. It wasn't just a transplant, it was a thread connecting two lives that might never have met. When he left her room, the hospital staff lined the hallway. Some clapped quietly, others simply nodded. They all knew who he was. But for once, Ethan didn't feel like the billionaire. He felt human. Still outside the hospital walls, the world had found him. Reporters camped on the sidewalk. Headlines flooded the news. Tech magnate donates kidney to stranger. Stocks in his company soared overnight. Philanthropy blogs called him the modern saint. Ethan didn't read any of it. He instructed his assistant to give no comment, to refuse every interview. This wasn't a publicity stunt, he said firmly. It was a promise. But fame has a way of intruding even when uninvited. Letters began arriving, hundreds, then thousands, from strangers across the country. Some shared their gratitude, others their pain. Many simply wrote, "You reminded me that good still exists." Each night when the noise became too much, Ethan would return to the hospital long after visiting hours ended. The nurses let him in quietly. He'd sit by Elena's bed watching her sleep, or by Lila's side as she drew in her sketchbook. One evening, she handed him a folded piece of paper. "It's for you," she said shyly. He unfolded it and saw a drawing 3 stick figures holding hands under a sun made of gold crayon. Above it, in crooked letters, she had written, "Thank you for giving the light back." Ethan felt his throat tighten. He wanted to say something profound, but all he managed was a whisper. "You already had the light, Lila. I just needed to see it." By spring, Elena was strong enough to walk again. The hospital released both patients the same week. Reporters swarmed outside the entrance cameras, flashing microphones raised, shouting questions. Ethan ignored them, guiding Elena and Lila to a waiting car. As they drove through Central Park, the trees were budding and sunlight spilled through the branches like gold dust. Lila pressed her face to the window. "It's so pretty," she said, "like everything got cleaned." Ethan glanced at her reflection in the glass. Sometimes it takes a storm to see the world clearly again. When he dropped them off at their small apartment, Elena hesitated before getting out. "I don't know how to thank you," she said again. He smiled. "Then don't. Just promise me one thing: never stop helping people. You've got more power than you think." She laughed softly. "That sounds like something you should tell yourself." After they left, Ethan sat in the car for a long time, watching the doorway until it closed behind them. The city outside buzzed with life, people rushing, horns blaring, but he felt calm. Purpose had replaced the silence that used to haunt him. That night, back in his penthouse, he walked past the awards and stock certificates hanging on his wall. They no longer meant anything. On his desk sat the wrinkled paper from the night he met Lila. He placed her new drawing beside it, side by side, 2 small, imperfect reminders of everything money could never buy. He didn't sleep much anymore. Instead, he planned something practical, something lasting. He called his foundation's board the next morning. "I'm restructuring everything," he said. "No more vanity projects. I want to create something real for children like Lila, for families like hers." "What do you want to call it?" his assistant asked. Ethan looked out the window, the city shimmering under the morning sun. "Paper hearts," he said finally, "because sometimes the smallest, most fragile things can save a life." There was silence on the line. Then a quiet reply, "That's beautiful, sir." Ethan hung up, feeling the weight of those words settle deep inside him. For years, he had measured success in numbers. Now, he measured it in heartbeats. And somewhere in a small apartment across the river, a little girl named Lila Bennett looked up at the night sky and whispered a simple prayer for the man who had once held her, and for the light that had returned to them both. A year had passed since the night snow fell over Manhattan, the night a little girl asked a billionaire to hold her for a moment. Seasons had turned, but for Ethan Crawford, time no longer moved in quarters or earnings reports, it moved in heartbeats. The morning sun spilled across Central Park, painting everything in gold. A small crowd gathered near the entrance where a new building stood quietly against the skyline. Its glass facade reflected the trees and sky like a mirror, and above its doors hung a simple sign, the Paper Hearts Center. No luxury branding, no grand speeches, just an idea turned real. A place where families in crisis could find help, where sick children could get free care, and where no one had to face the world alone. Inside, volunteers hurried around, setting up tables covered with toys and books. Journalists mingled quietly, though Ethan had refused all formal interviews. "This day isn't about me," he'd said. "It's about what love can build." He stood near the back of the crowd, hands in his coat pockets, watching as the final ribbon fluttered in the breeze. His hair had more gray now, his face thinner, but there was light in his eyes, the kind that comes only from peace earned the hard way. Beside him, Lila Bennett adjusted the microphone nervously. She was 10 now, taller, her voice surer. A small paper heart pin shimmered on her jacket, the same symbol that appeared on every volunteer's shirt. She looked out at the crowd, then at Ethan, who nodded once, encouraging her. "My name is Lila," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "A year ago, my mom was very sick. I thought I was going to lose her. But then someone stopped to listen. He didn't give me money. He gave me something better, a hug. That hug changed everything." The audience grew still. "He taught me that kindness isn't about being rich," she continued. "It's about seeing someone when everyone else looks away. Because sometimes all people need is to know they're not invisible." Ethan felt a knot rise in his throat. Around him, reporters lowered their cameras. Even the wind seemed to quiet as Lila spoke. She turned slightly toward him. "Mr. Crawford, you showed me what it means to care. And now, this place will show the world." Applause filled the air, warm, honest, real. Ethan didn't step forward. He didn't want to take the moment from her. It was hers. It was theirs. After the ceremony, families began wandering through the new center, children, laughing doctors, explaining services, volunteers greeting guests. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, catching on the wall of names etched in brass. Near the center, one name stood alone, Elena Bennett, the first light. Elena stood nearby, healthy and radiant, talking with one of the nurses. She still walked carefully, but her smile was easy now. When she saw Ethan, she crossed the room and embraced him. "You kept your promise," she said. He smiled, so did you. They walked together to the garden behind the center. It was simple benches, a small fountain rose of paper heart sculptures that children had painted in bright colors. Each one bore a message, "Hope lives here." Lila ran ahead laughing as she tried to catch the snowflakes drifting from the sky. It was the first snowfall of the season, soft and light. Ethan sat on a bench watching her. "You know," he said quietly a year ago, "I thought I was saving you." Elena looked at him, and now he watched the little girl dance through the flakes. "Now I know you were saving me." For a moment, neither spoke. The fountain gurgled softly, the sound blending with the laughter of children and the whisper of wind through the trees. When Lila returned, she climbed up beside him and wrapped her arms around his shoulders. "Sir?" she said, teasing the word like an echo of that long-ago night. "Could you hold me for a moment?" Ethan chuckled, his eyes shining. "Always." She hugged him tightly. Around them, cameras clicked, people watched, but the world seemed to fade away. It wasn't a photo opportunity, it was life simple and full. Later that evening, when the crowd was gone, Ethan walked alone through the empty hallways of the center. His footsteps echoed softly on the tile. On the wall near the entrance, a framed letter hung behind glass, the original paper note Lila had once handed him, preserved like a relic. "I can clean. I can help. I don't cry in front of people." And just below it, in neat handwriting added months later, "I can love. I can thank you." He stood there for a long time, reading the words over and over. Then he smiled, the kind of smile that comes from knowing you've finally done something that matters. When he stepped outside, snow was still falling thicker now, blanketing the park in white. Across the street, he saw families leaving holding hands, laughing. Lila and Elena waved from a distance before disappearing into the swirl of snow. Ethan turned his face upward, letting the flakes melt against his skin. For years, he'd believed success was about control numbers, deals, the illusion of permanence. But standing there under the quiet weight of winter, he understood something truer. A legacy isn't built in skyscrapers or stock portfolios. It's built in moments like this, in a child's laughter, a mother's recovery, a stranger's kindness. In the warmth of a single hug that refuses to fade. He took one last look at the glowing sign of the Paper Hearts Center, then started walking home through the snow, his breath misting in the cold air. Behind him, the building lights shone brighter than the city skyline, as if the world itself was reflecting back the truth he had spent a lifetime searching for. You don't have to save the world. Sometimes saving one soul saves you too. And though no one could hear it over the hum of New York somewhere in the falling snow, Ethan Crawford whispered a quiet thank you to a little girl who once needed a hug, and to the life she gave back in return. Ethan Crawford's story is one that began with silence and ended with purpose. For years he was a man who had everything, power, money, and the admiration of the world, but none of it filled the emptiness left by loss. It took a single moment, a child's trembling voice on a snowy night, to awaken what he had buried long ago, his humanity. When Lila Bennett looked up at him with those simple, desperate eyes and asked to be held, something inside him broke open. That hug didn't just comfort a little girl, it resurrected a man who had forgotten how to feel. From that night forward, Ethan's life changed course. The billionaire who once lived above the world found himself walking among it again. When he learned about Lila's mother, Elena, lying in a hospital bed without hope, he didn't send a donation or a lawyer, he went himself. What he did next shocked everyone, even himself. He gave her a part of his own body, his kidney, his literal lifeblood. It was an act so unthinkable, so pure, that it transformed not just 2 lives, but countless others who would later hear their story. The man who once measured his worth in profit learned to measure it in compassion. The boy who lost his daughter found her again, not in body, but in spirit, through the small girl who reminded him what love looked like. And when the Paper Hearts Foundation opened its doors, it wasn't built on wealth, it was built on one truth, that kindness is the most powerful investment of all. Ethan's journey is a reminder that redemption doesn't always come from grand gestures or public praise. Sometimes it begins with something as small as a single act of grace, a hand extended, a word spoken, a hug offered when the world feels cold. His story reminds us that no matter how much we lose or how far we drift from who we once were, love can still find its way back to us if we're brave enough to open the door. In today's fast-paced, disconnected world, this message matters more than ever. We scroll through suffering every day, people struggling, hurting, forgotten, and we convince ourselves we can't make a difference. But you can. You don't need billions of dollars or a grand foundation. You just need a heart willing to see someone truly see them. Because sometimes saving one life, or simply holding one person long enough for them to believe they matter, can change everything. So let this story remind you, the smallest act of compassion can spark the greatest transformation. When you choose empathy over indifference, you don't just heal others, you heal yourself. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you believe again in the quiet power of kindness, don't let it stop here. Subscribe to this channel. Share this story and help us keep spreading messages that touch the heart and awaken the soul. Your support gives us the strength to create more stories like this, stories that remind us that even in a world obsessed with success, it's love, not wealth, that leaves the greatest legacy. Because in the end, Ethan Crawford didn't save the world, he just saved one little girl, and that was enough.